In early March 2026, U.S. and Israeli forces launched military operations against Iran. Within hours, oil markets reacted. Brent crude jumped 8.5%, hitting nearly $93 a barrel. U.S. crude followed, up over 12%. Gas prices started climbing at stations across the country. The White House was asked the obvious question: would the U.S. tap its emergency oil reserve? On March 8th, the answer was no. The president said there is a lot of oil out there. 3 days later, everything changed. On March 11th, the U.S. announced it would release 172 million barrels of oil, joining a coalition led by the International Energy Agency, IEA, in the largest coordinated emergency oil release in world history. Over 400 million barrels across allied nations were deployed in a single move. Most Americans had no idea where those barrels were coming from. They did not know what it was, where it sat, or that it even existed. It is called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and the story of what it is, how it got depleted, and whether it can actually protect us is one of the most important infrastructure stories nobody talks about. To understand why the U.S. built a secret oil reserve, you have to go back to October 1973. Arab member states of OPEC announced an oil embargo against the United States in retaliation for American support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The effects were immediate and brutal. Gas lines stretched around city blocks. Prices quadrupled. President Nixon ordered rationing. Thermostats in federal buildings were turned down. The American economy, the most powerful in the world, was brought to its knees, not by a military attack, but by a supply chain. That experience haunted Washington. And 2 years later, Congress passed the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. President Ford ordered the construction of a hidden emergency oil supply. The goal was simple: never be held hostage again. What they built was unlike anything the public imagined. Most people, when they hear the words oil reserve, picture a tank farm. Massive steel cylinders sitting behind a fence somewhere in the desert. What the U.S. actually built is far stranger and far more impressive. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is stored in 61 underground caverns, carved into natural salt domes along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. 4 sites are used: Bayou Choctaw, Big Hill, Bryan Mound, and West Hackberry. Each cavern is roughly 200 feet wide and 2,000 feet deep. That's tall enough to swallow the Empire State Building underground, with room to spare. Salt was chosen deliberately. It is impermeable. It is self-sealing. When crude oil is stored inside a salt cavern, the rock itself acts as a natural seal, isolating the oil from groundwater and external contamination. It does not corrode. It does not rust. It does not leak. As of February 2026, those caverns hold approximately 416 million barrels of crude oil. That's enough to fill over 25,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The authorized capacity is 714 million barrels. The reserve is less than 60% full. Getting the oil out is a feat of engineering that most people never think about. Operators pump fresh water into the bottom of a cavern. Oil floats on water. The pressure from the incoming water pushes the crude upward through pipes to marine terminals on the Gulf Coast. From there, tankers carry the oil to refineries. At maximum release rate, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve can deliver 4.4 million barrels per day. It can sustain that rate for up to 90 consecutive days. The first delivery from the reserve happened in 1977. 412,000 barrels of light sweet crude were sent to a refinery in Louisiana as a test run. The system worked then, it still works now. But the question of how much is left and why is where the story gets complicated. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR, hit its peak on December 27, 2009, at 726.6 million barrels. The caverns were essentially full. Since then, the reserve has been drawn down repeatedly, and not always for the reasons it was designed for. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the United States released 17 million barrels. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina disrupted Gulf Coast refining, and 20.8 million barrels were released to keep supply flowing. In 2011, during the Libya crisis, the Obama administration released 30 million barrels in coordination with the International Energy Agency. Those were genuine emergencies. But over the decades, Congress discovered something useful about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It could be monetized. Through a series of budget deals and spending bills, lawmakers mandated drawdowns of the reserve to raise cash for other government priorities, a total of roughly $18.3 billion in offsets through 2025. The emergency tank had quietly become a piggy bank. Every barrel sold to fund a spending bill was a barrel no longer available for an actual emergency. Then came 2022. After Russia invaded Ukraine, President Biden announced the release of 180 million barrels over 6 months, the largest single drawdown in the reserve's history. The goal was to soften the impact of soaring gas prices on American households. It worked in the short term. What it left behind was a reserve at its lowest level since the 1980s and no serious plan to refill it. Refilling the Strategic Petroleum Reserve sounds straightforward. Buy oil, pump it underground. In practice, it is expensive, slow, and politically inconvenient. The government must purchase crude at market prices. When prices are high, which they tend to be during the exact moments when refilling feels most urgent, the cost is enormous. It also requires securing pipeline access and carefully timing purchases to avoid disrupting commercial markets. During his 2024 campaign, President Trump promised to fill the strategic reserves right to the top. A year into his second term, with oil trading above $100 a barrel, the reserve remained below 60% of authorized capacity. Now, the March 2026 release will draw it down further. Refilling under wartime oil prices could cost the U.S. Treasury tens of billions of dollars. The tank that nobody talks about is being drained again, and this time, there is no easy path back. There is another layer most people miss. The infrastructure itself is vulnerable. All 4 Strategic Petroleum Reserve sites sit along the Gulf Coast, one of the most hurricane-prone coastlines in the world. In 2005, Hurricanes Katrina and Ike forced emergency releases from those facilities. The pipelines connecting the caverns to refineries are aging and geographically concentrated. A major storm, a cyber attack, or an infrastructure failure could compromise the system precisely when it is needed most. The bipartisan infrastructure law allocated funds for modernization. The upgrades are happening, but slowly. Some of the cavern walls have been operational since the late 1970s, and they require constant geological monitoring to ensure structural integrity. Modernization is underway, but not fast enough. This is a system designed in the Cold War, running on Cold War infrastructure, being asked to protect a 21st century economy. The contrast is striking, the Cold War design meeting modern demand. Here is the irony at the center of all of this. In 1973, the United States was deeply dependent on foreign oil. The entire logic of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was to protect against foreign supply cutoffs. Today, the United States is a net petroleum exporter. It produces more oil than it imports. By the original measure, energy independence has been achieved. And yet, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve matters more now, not less. It still matters. The United States is embedded in a global oil market. American-produced crude is priced against Brent, the international benchmark. When a tanker cannot pass through the Strait of Hormuz, or when a refinery goes offline in the Middle East, prices rise everywhere, including at American gas stations. Energy independence does not mean energy insulation. The math tells the story clearly. The United States consumes roughly 20 million barrels of petroleum per day. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, at its current level, can cover less than 95 days of partial supply, and only at its maximum release rate. The International Energy Agency's record global release of 400 million barrels in March 2026, every barrel from every Allied reserve deployed at once, covered only about 20 days of supply disrupted by a Strait of Hormuz closure. Math matters. The global spare production capacity right now sits at just 2.1 million barrels per day. That is the lowest buffer since 2014. Lowest is the right word. The margin is thinner than most people realize. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was built to solve a specific problem, a world where the United States was vulnerable to a deliberate foreign cutoff. The 61 salt caverns along the Gulf Coast are doing exactly what they were designed to do. The engineering works. The system works. It was designed for this role. The question is whether what those caverns hold is still enough for the world we have built. A world where oil travels through 21-mile choke points, where price shocks cross borders in hours, and where the emergency reserve has been used to manage budgets, lower gas prices before elections, and fund diplomatic relationships. Is it enough? The tank exists. It is underground. Most people will never see it, never think about it, and never know it is there until the day the price at the pump jumps without warning. Never is the right word. That is the system protecting your energy supply. Now you know it is there. If you want to understand the hidden infrastructure behind the headlines, the pipelines, the choke points, the reserves that keep the modern world running, subscribe to Under the Surface. There's always more beneath what you can see.